Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning for the webinar with Zali Jestrimski about the role of dingoes in our ecosystems. We're wanting to explore what actually is a dingo, to hear about how complex they are in our ecosystems, and to hear a little bit about how a cattle station like Wooleen benefits from the retention of dingoes as a management strategy. So this webinar is supported by Lottery West and the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation through their SoilWise program. My name is Bonnie and I'm the RegenWA program manager here at Perth NRM. And just before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're all tuning in from today and pay our respects to the cultural elders of the past, present and emerging. I acknowledge the First Nations' deep spiritual connection to country and the sustainable land management carried out over thousands of years. So we're very pleased to have Zali joining us today. So Zali completed a Bachelor of Science, majoring in wildlife and conservation biology. And during her degree, she published research on wild dingoes in Victoria and worked with captive dingoes at the Australian Dingo Foundation Sanctuary for the past 6 years. But now Zali lives and works at Wooleen Station in the Murchison region of WA, which is a cattle station focused on regeneration and conservation. And while here, Zali is also completing a postgrad research degree on the effects of dingoes in this particular semi-arid landscape. So just a bit of housekeeping. If anyone does have questions throughout, you can pop it in the chat box up the top, and we'll have time at the very end to go through them. So feel free to pop them in there as we go. But yeah, we'll have time at the end to go through questions. And with all of that, I'll hand it over to Zali to share her screen and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And thanks, guys, for joining us. I'm very excited that I can share my knowledge on dingoes with you all. I'm currently sitting in a dingo enclosure at Woolen Station. We actually have 2 captive dingoes that live here. They might come and say hello at some point, and if not, maybe at the end we can do a little meet with the dingoes if we have time. But yeah, so yeah, great intro. Thanks, Bonnie. I might try and load up my PowerPoint now. See how we go with that. I know it did take a couple of minutes to load up before.
So how many dingoes are in the enclosure at the moment?
Only 2. Yeah, so we've got just 2 dingoes that live here, and both of them are around at the moment, probably having a snooze after our long walk this morning. Yeah. With dingoes, it's really important to have 2. If you have captive dingoes, it's very important to have 2 together. It's pretty cool just to have one on their own. They're very sociable animals and even sort of mate for life, which I'll cover later. But yeah, so we've just got a male and female, and their names are Steve and Eulalia. Eulalia is actually named after a grass that we're trying to get back here. There is some growing in a couple of the creeks here. The common name of the grass is silky brown top. It's quite a pretty grass when it's got its seed heads on it. Great. So my PowerPoint's halfway through loading.
So what's it like at Wooleen at the moment?
It's busy. We've got tourist season well and truly in swing at the moment. People are here to see wildflowers, which we've got a pretty slow wildflower season. We had lots of summer rain, but I think we need to have more winter rain to have them really booming. But all of the species are out. There's things like desert peas out at the moment, which is fantastic. We've just kind of come out. It feels like we've just come out of winter, really, because it's been really cold the past few weeks, and then only the last 2 days it's been 30 degrees here, which has been really lovely. Wow. Yeah, cool. So I think my PowerPoint should be there for everybody to see. Can you get, yeah, all good? Fantastic. Cool. So I'm going to be talking all about our apex predator, the dingo. So Bonnie already introduced me, but yeah, my name's Zali, and I am currently studying dingoes or dingo ecology here at Wooleen Station, which is really exciting, as well as just generally working for Wooleen as well at the same time, which has been great. So the first thing I would like to do is acknowledge the Wurundjeri Yamaji people as the traditional custodians of the land that we're on right now. I also want to acknowledge the many nations across Australia where you all might be viewing from or where you might work or travel, and also acknowledge and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I just wanted to note that the Wurundjeri language is actually one that still persists today. There's only 60 Wurundjeri speakers, but they do have a dictionary, which means that language can be passed down to future generations. So I thought I would just share one word with you today, which is dingo, and that's Ngubanu in Wurundjeri. Wonderful. So this PowerPoint will be split up into two halves. The first half is all about what a dingo actually is. I'll probably cover quite a few myths in this first half. I'll compare them to domestic dogs and explain how they're different to domestic dogs as well. And then the second half, I will talk all about the role of the dingo in the environment, so what their role actually is in our landscapes, but also I will talk about their role on a cattle station as well. We're actually the only property in the Murchison region that doesn't kill dingoes, so it's pretty controversial and a rare thing to do at the moment. So I'll just also cover like why we choose to retain dingoes rather than kill them here as well. So the dingo is actually its own distinct species. So even though dogs and dingoes can breed together, we still classify them separately taxonomically. And that's for a few reasons. One of the reasons is that they are a canid. So things in the Canis genus, like that's written there, they can actually breed together. So other animals that can breed together include wolves and coyotes as well. So wolves can breed with coyotes, wolves can breed with dogs, and coyotes can breed with dogs as well. And same with dingoes. So dingoes can breed with dogs. But even though these animals can all breed together, I'm sure we can all agree that a wolf is a pretty different animal to a dingo, and again, a very different animal to a dog, a domestic dog as well. And so it's really important for land management to be classifying dingoes and dogs separately for the same reason. Like dingoes perform a very different role out there in our landscapes. They behave very differently. They're physiologically very different. So it's still very important to classify them separately. Whereas, our domestic dogs, like we don't want them in our wild places, and nor can they perform the same role that a dingo can play. So with that said, I'm going to show everybody these two photos first. I'm sure that even if those labels weren't there, everybody could tell that the one on the left is a dog and the one on the right is a dingo. But a lot of people wouldn't actually recognize that this second photo is also of a dingo. So dingoes can come in a whole range of colours, and this black and tan colouring is actually a colour that dingoes have always come in, even before domestic dogs were here in Australia. So I'm sure, we can all recognise that this classic tan or ginger, we'd all associate that with being dingo. But it's surprising how many people aren't aware that dingoes do actually come in a whole range of different colours. Dingoes can come in white or cream, and they can come in black and tan, like you just saw, as well as the classic tan or ginger colour. And 90% of dingoes come in tan or ginger. And that's because it's the dominant colour gene. Only the remaining 10% come in these other colours, but you still see them around quite regularly. We've had all three colours actually spotted here at Wooleen Station by tourists or guests. The colours do help with the dingoes blending in to certain environments. If you think about a tan or a ginger dingo can blend in really well out here in like the red dirt. They can blend in well in dry grass and also on sandy beaches. So there's lots of environment types where you blend in quite well as a ginger dingo. But if you were a black and tan dingo, you're more suited to our sort of forested areas and dark areas like that. And then our white or our cream, people often confuse the white dingoes with like an alpine dingo or a dingo that you might find in the snow, but it's actually not a good thing to be a white dingo in the snow. And the reason for that is when the snow melts, because it only really snows in Australia for 3 or 4 months. So once the snow melts, you're in a dark forested area. So you actually have more black and tan dingoes in the snowy areas than you do white or cream. There is another environment type where white or cream dingoes are commonly found, and that would be in salt lakes. So if you think about like Caddy Thunder or Lake Eyre in South Australia, and also areas in Western Australia as well, those white or cream dingoes blend in really well. But as I say, you can have all three colours all across Australia. They're not just restricted to those landscape types. Cool, and then I'm going to confuse everybody probably a lot more by showing them this next slide. Here it comes up. So these are all pure dingo colours, which surprises a lot of people. This is pretty new to our knowledge as well. So we've got at the top there one that looks kind of like a German Shepherd with the dark back. That's a sable colouring. We've got the black and tan, which you all know about now anyway. We've got that classic ginger or sandy colour where, like our dingoes are blending in very well there against the dry grass. Then at the bottom, some of the more surprising colours, we've got white with brown ears and then also brindle as well, kind of like a staffy. So all of these colours are pure dingo colours, and I'm sure when most people see these other colours out in the bush, they probably assume that it's a feral dog or a dog that's gone wild, which is not the case at all. They are actually pure dingoes. So after I show that, a lot of people say, well, then how do we know if something's a dingo? And to answer that question, I'm going to show you this slide here with the proportions of a domestic dog and a dingo. So in my opinion, the most obvious difference, if you were looking at a dingo and a domestic dog side by side, the most obvious difference is the size of the chest and the size of the head. So I'm sure you guys can see there that dog there has this really broad chest and a narrower head, and then this dingo has a broad head and a narrower chest. So every single dingo has that relationship of a really large head and then narrower body, and every single domestic dog, whether it's a Chihuahua, a Husky, a Kelpie, they all have a broader chest and a narrower head. Even things like Staffies that have, like a really broad head, they still have an even broader chest. It is a bit of a survival thing for dingoes to have this broad head and narrow chest. And that the reason for that might surprise people, but it's because dingoes are actually den animals and they need to get into tight spaces pretty frequently out in the wild. And a dingo knows that where their head fits, the rest of their body can actually fit as well. So they actually can use the width of their head to measure whether or not they're going to fit through a hole. So dingoes do actually dig their own dens, not like domestic dogs. I know that domestic dogs quite like to have a good dig in the backyard, but they don't actually know how to create a hole like a den or a room underground. And it's really important for dingoes to have that, to be able to build their own den, because, like here at Wooleen, it can get up to 50 degrees over summer. So in the heat of the day, you can just go underground to cool down if you're a dingo. And if you're, where it's colder, down south and over east, you can hop into your den to keep warm as well when it's really cold. It also means that things like wedge-tailed eagles, which do prey upon dingo cubs, means that the dingo cubs are going to be safe if they're inside something like a den. And dingoes don't just build their own dens, they can use something that's been started by another animal, and they can also use like cave systems as well. So like out here, we actually have lots of like rocky outcrop country, and so dingoes can often, use those as their houses. So I've got another photo here just comparing the dingo and a domestic dog. This domestic dog breed is called a Shiba Inu. It's got a pretty similar looking face to dingoes, but you can just see there, like he's got that nice broad chest compared to the dingo on the left there, who's got this nice narrow chest. And I mentioned that a dingo knows that where their head fits, the rest of their body can follow. But you're probably thinking that seems kind of pointless because he's got these really long legs. And so how is he fitting these into these tight spaces? And to answer that question, this is actually probably my favorite thing about dingoes. Dingoes can do something called subluxation. And essentially what that means is they're really, really flexible. So a dingo can actually move their legs like totally up in line with their rib cage. They can move their wrists around, so they can actually use their wrists to like hold on to things, unlike domestic dogs. They can also like pull up all of their feet, say all the way up in line with their rib cage, and their front legs can actually go all the way behind them in line with their backbone as well, which is pretty cool. So if you can just imagine, the dingo can pretty much entirely like fold up to the size of its rib cage to get into tight spaces. It's pretty awesome to see in person. And I know that when when we do have dingoes that come out to talks and tours and things, they're pretty happy for us to kind of like fold them up and show people what they can do, which is pretty cool. So yeah, physiologically, dingoes are pretty different to dogs, and a lot of it, I understand that, to the untrained eye, dingoes and dogs can look really similar. But once you sort of know what to look out for and you learn these differences, about like their bone structure and things, they're actually pretty unique animals. It's pretty cool. Another difference between the dingoes and the dogs in terms of physiology is actually that their bone structure is different. So they have things like an elongated rib cage. And what that means is they have the same number of ribs, but unlike a domestic dog's, which will divide between the shoulders, it actually divides lower down. And essentially that's just more protection for things like their stomach. So a domestic dog actually only really has a flap of skin between their stomach and the outside world. So there's not much protection there. Whereas for dingoes, they have, that bone structure that really protects their stomach and their vital organs. So there's lots of these little differences, and I could probably point them out for the whole presentation, but I won't do that. So if you have questions about physiology of dingoes at the end, I'm happy to answer that later on. I'm going to move on now to the behaviour of dingoes because, in my opinion, whilst the physiology is really kind of cool and it means that dingoes can survive out in the wild, it's not what really sets them apart from dogs when they're behaving as an apex predator. So if we think about other apex predators in the world, things like lions and wolves and bears, there's always less of those animals, including dingoes, than there are of everything else in a balanced ecosystem. So like there's always less sharks than there are other fish. There's always less wolves than there are like elk and bison. And there's always less dingoes than there are, say, kangaroos. But those apex predators, they don't have anything predating from the top down. So they don't have anything sort of regulating their numbers above them. I mean, dingoes have people controlling them now massively, but in a balanced ecosystem where that's not occurring, dingoes that keep themselves at a low level, and so do, wolves and sharks as well. And there's something that they do in order to keep themselves at a low number in the landscape. And essentially that is having a really strict social structure. So it's because of their strict social structures that they're able to regulate their own numbers in our environments. So dingoes are very social animals, but there's also lots of rules to live by if you're a dingo. So it can be pretty strict and harsh out there for dingoes if they don't belong to a certain family group. So dingoes are territorial. They occupy really large territories. It can be anywhere between 25 square kilometres and 80 square kilometres, which is huge. Within one territory, you'll often either just have one dingo on its own, or you'll have a pair of dingoes, which is most likely. So that's like a male and female dingo occupying one territory. And then you can also have family groups. So you can have groups of dingoes. It's just rarer that you do have big groups of dingoes. So within a dingo family group, the rules are pretty tough. You have an alpha male and female pair, and then you have the young. You'll have the kids that can stick around year after year. And they're only really allowed to stick around if they obey the rules of mum and dad. So if they're submissive, they can help raise future litters. They're also not allowed to breed if they stick around in mum and dad's territory either. So it's only the alpha male and female that will breed. I've written here mate for life. So the alpha male female, or the two dingoes that occupy the territory, they do actually mate year after year as long as their family group stays intact. So essentially, in one territory, you'll have that male and female, and every single year after year, they're the only two that stay together. So they don't really like ever break up their own structures. Usually they do tend to stay together. So dingoes, they're not monogamous in the traditional sense of the word. I know that some birds, like if their mate was to pass away or something like that, they don't ever find another mate. But with dingoes, if their mate passes away, they can go and find another mate later on. But generally, they do mate for life. Dingoes also have equal parental care. And so what that means is mum and dad both have to stick around and raise the young. So I've got a photo there of Wandy, the dingo. I don't know if anybody's heard of Wandy. He became famous a few years ago. He went all over like ABC News, and he's got a book written about him as well, which is a really good little story. But that's a dad dingo there, Wandy, and he's there looking after his cubs. So yeah, dingoes, they're quite special in that the dads do actually help look after the young, and they have to if their young are going to survive out there in the wild. That means that they can go out and hunt, they can take shifts of who's looking after the young. And the dingoes, the male dingoes, they actually regurgitate food for their young as well. So they can absolutely help out in feeding cubs too. I just wanted to note as well that dingoes actually have a pretty high cub mortality. So often only 2 out of 5 dingoes in a litter would make it to breeding age. So it's pretty tough out there for dingoes. And it is, though, another way that predators regulate their numbers. It's pretty common. That's the way it is for lions and wolves as well. Cool. The last thing I've written there is annual breeding season. So dingoes only breed once a year, which is it's really cool. They breed based on seasons. So unlike domestic dogs, which can breed biannually, and it's not based on what the environment's doing at all. It's based on just when they come into heat, then they can keep breeding biannually after that. With dingoes, they actually only ever have cubs in winter. So they come into breeding season earlier in the year, so like March, April, then they have a 60-day gestation, and then cubs will be born around winter. So that's another way that they can regulate their numbers out there as well. Great, so that's the first half of the talk done. So that's kind of tried to explain how dingoes are different to dogs, how to tell apart a dingo and a dog, and also covering some myths, hopefully, about dingoes, especially the one about them coming in different colours. I think that one surprises a lot of people. Cool, so we'll go on to the second half. So the dingo is our apex predator, but they're pretty small. They're actually only generally about 15 kilos, which is tiny. And they look a little bit like a dog, whereas other countries, they have things like lions, like I keep mentioning, and big cats as well. If you think about like panthers and things. And, in Australia, we just have this little tiny 15-kilo animal to do the big job as our predator. And dingoes do that job really, really well if we let them. But essentially, the reason that dingoes are so small and still fit into our ecosystems is because if you think about native Australian animals, we don't really have any big ones. So the biggest animals we have in Australia that dingoes are taking down are things like kangaroos and emus. And I don't know if anybody's seen a size comparison between like an emu and an ostrich, but even then an emu is quite small in comparison. And our kangaroos, of course, are quite small. And dingoes are usually going to be going after kangaroo joeys, like the young, just like any other apex predator, more so than going after something like a big male kangaroo. So that's partially why dingoes are not really pack animals either, in the same way that wolves are. And it's also why we don't need a massive predator to fit into our ecosystems. Dingoes have 2 really important roles to play, and these are those. So regulating herbivores is very important, and the second one there is controlling foxes and cats. So dingoes do an incredible job at regulating our herbivores. Our biggest herbivore that they control is, of course, our kangaroo. And I didn't just mean biggest as in size, I also mean that all dingoes love kangaroos. So it doesn't really matter where you're looking at dingo diets across Australia. You know, if you're looking at dingo scat contents or dingo stomach contents, the studies always show that kangaroos are number one for dingoes. So dingoes love kangaroos. And it's fantastic. That's what they're here to regulate. So if you think about it across Australia, everywhere that we've taken out the dingo, we have to start culling kangaroos, or we have a really big problem with kangaroos. So in any area where you take out the predator, you know, it makes sense that you have sort of like a kangaroo explosion in population numbers. We all know that kangaroos are pretty awesome and pretty good at breeding up their numbers as well. You know, they can have 3 on the go at once in terms of you know, making offspring. So yeah, pretty good breeders, but it does mean that in a balanced ecosystem, they have a predator, which is the dingo, to keep their numbers in check. Dingoes don't just regulate the number of herbivores, they also keep healthy populations of herbivores. And again, that's the role of any predator. So essentially, dingoes are taking out the slow, the sick, the weak, and the injured. So yeah, that's just the general job of predators across the world. The second thing I've got there, controlling foxes and cats. Dingoes are really good at controlling foxes. I think it's mostly a territorial thing. So even if they're not going to eat the fox, I think it's like, you know, we don't want foxes on our territory, which is fantastic. So they do a fantastic job at controlling foxes. The other thing that they control pretty well is cats. So we know that dingoes can't necessarily get rid of every cat in our landscape, but they definitely decrease the number of cats in our landscapes. We also know that, you know, dingoes and cats avoid each other, or sorry, more likely cats avoid dingoes. And because cats are avoiding dingoes, it does mean that other little wildlife that cats would normally go after, you know, they have a bit of respite or a bit of a chance to be out and about when they're in dingo territory, which is great. Cool. So I've just mentioned these 2 jobs that dingoes have and that they play really well. And I wanted to relate this directly to Wooleen Station and show you guys how the wild dingoes here have been massively beneficial for Wooleen Station, not just for cattle productivity, but also for our native wildlife as well and for our landscape. So for those of you who haven't been out here or don't know much about Wooleen, Wooleen Station is sort of inland from Shark Bay or Denham. Our closest major town or city where we get supplies from is Geraldton. We are a cattle property in the Murchison Shire, and currently David and Francis, the owners of Wooleen Station, are actually using wild dingoes to manage the total grazing pressure. So I'll explain this quite a bit shortly. But essentially, I already mentioned at the start that we're one of the only stations out here that don't kill dingoes, that choose to actually retain dingoes. We've had really good benefits from retaining dingoes out here. But dingoes actually haven't been here for very long, wild dingoes. So back in the day, sheep production was the first way that we used this landscape after colonisation. And through that time, you know, if you're bringing sheep out to this area, one animal that you really want to get rid of is the dingo. And so dingo control back in the day was so successful that they actually entirely wiped out dingoes from this region. So the Murchison Shire had no dingoes here at all for a pretty long time. You know, and there's a few things that happened over history as to why dingoes have come back into the region now. We still have baiting and bounties on dingoes in this area, but dingoes have still been able to make their way back into the Murchison Shire, partially because our, you know, our dingo management or our dingo control has, even though it hasn't ceased, it's definitely not as effective as it used to be. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to also answer them later on as well. So the main point to make there is that dingoes weren't here for a long time, and in the early 2000s, naturally, dingoes have made their way back into this area. And the effects have been pretty awesome to see. So we, you know, I talked about how dingoes regulate herbivores and also foxes and cats as well, if I go back to this. So now I can relate this directly to Wooleen Station. So or the Murchison region in general, actually, not just Wooleen. So when dingoes came back into this area, there was a massive kangaroo problem here. Every station in this area had a kangaroo shooter, and everybody was, constantly controlling the kangaroos as well. You flip forward to today, since the dingoes have come back, and nobody has a kangaroo shooter anymore because we don't need to be controlling the kangaroos, which is fantastic. So essentially, the kangaroo population went up. It spiked massively here in the time that there were no dingoes in the area, partially because we took out its apex predator, and then partially also because of man-made watering points as well. But definitely the dingoes are the thing that really do regulate the kangaroo populations, and without the dingoes, you just really can't get a control of the kangaroos. So the dingoes have come back. The kangaroo population is actually estimated to have declined by a massive 90%. It is huge. And so that has been fantastic for our landscape. So if you think about kangaroos are a mostly grass dominant eater, out here, grasses have been massively overgrazed. There's not many grasses left. I talked about Eulalia at the beginning, our dingo, named after one of those grasses that we're trying to get back into our ecosystems here. So Wooleen has now established things like grass nurseries to try and get the seed bank back into this area. But yeah, essentially from a time when there were no dingoes and a whole lot of kangaroos, our landscape here has been incredibly overgrazed. There is another herbivore that dingoes have done an amazing job in controlling, and it's a non-native one. That is our feral goats. So back in the day, there were a lot of feral goats here. Looking at the figures, I think it was in 1992, there was something like 70,000 feral goats mustered and culled in the Murchison. So a massive amount of goats here back in the day. We actually don't think there's any goats left. So goats haven't been sighted here since 2014, and there wasn't the last actual muster and export of goats was a few years before that as well. So people haven't seen goats here for a long time. I've never seen a goat here. I can't imagine the landscape with goats here now. Francis and Dave tell me about, walking up onto a rocky outcrop here and just seeing the goats take off on the other side. I just can't even imagine that now because I've never seen it. There are still goats coming in from Geraldton. So we have a town that we pass on the way in here called Mullawa. We still see goats between Geraldton and Mullawa. So there are still goats on the coast, but just in the Murchison Shire itself, the people haven't seen goats for a long time, which has been fantastic. So again, I'm sure we all know that feral goats do a number on our vegetation and massively smash our landscapes and overgraze the country here. So, we're in a semi-arid environment here. Rainfall is certainly a limiting factor. Things out here, our shrubs and our bushes and our trees are very slow growing because of how much or how little rainfall that we get. So it's going to take a long time for the country to recover from overgrazing from these animals. But, with the dingoes, I think we have a chance and we can do it, which is fantastic. In terms of foxes and cats, the foxes has actually been the same success story as goats. So we haven't seen a goat here. Well, sorry, a fox here. I've never seen a fox here myself. I know that the owners haven't seen foxes here for a really long time as well. We're pretty sure that there aren't any foxes around anymore. I was actually talking to somebody from Murchison Shire recently who's only been here for a few years, and she was saying, oh, I thought that foxes just couldn't live here because the summers are too hot. But, foxes were massively abundant not that long ago. So it's not because it's too hot here. It's definitely, the dingoes have done a massive job at controlling the foxes here. In terms of cats, we still have feral cats here on Wooleen. But, as I said, the dingoes definitely decrease their populations. And the exciting news is that our 2 captive dingoes that live here, they actually have caught 2 feral cats since they've been here. So that's pretty cool. That's just in the last couple of months. So really exciting and pretty promising. So this slide here is just going through everything that I've just talked about, essentially. So it's just the food web there. You can see that the dingo is up the top. The dingo is controlling the kangaroos and feral goats. which has massive benefits for our grasses and general herb biomass as well. And I'm sure you all know here that that's got a big feedback loop attached to it. On the other side, we've got foxes and cats being controlled, which gives a great respite for our native mice, reptiles and birds. And again, that's feeding into that whole feedback loop into our ecosystems as well. So you can probably start to imagine that the dingo has a pretty substantial role to play in our landscapes across Australia. And it's pretty controversial, especially on pastoral property where there's livestock involved. But it's also controversial if we're trying to protect our other native animals as well. So some people ask the question, do we really want dingoes in an area if we have small endangered, marsupials and things trying to survive? And I think it's a great question to ask. So essentially, Australia is in a pretty devastating situation at the moment. We have the worst extinction rate of any country in the world to date. So it's very sad, and it's definitely something that a lot of people are working really, really hard to combat. We have lots of things like this little guy in the corner here, a bettong, who are really struggling. They still are existing. They're not extinct yet, but there's not many of them. So things like bettongs actually used to live here at Wooleen Station, and there's actually no bettongs left here anymore. We know that they used to live here because their mounds are everywhere. So there's lots of evidence of them in our landscapes, but they're not here anymore. These little critters like bettongs would be helping massively in, like soil turnover out here, would really help with some of the bare ground issues that we have here. So it's really sad that they're not here anymore, but essentially they were wiped out in the time when foxes and cats were here. But also because of the kangaroos and goats, you can imagine that their little houses like tussock grasses and things, and also their feed is really diminished as well. So not only do you have sort of habitat degradation, but you also have the introduction of the fox, which really didn't give these guys a chance. So I'll go back to that question, like, do we really want dingoes in landscapes if we have things like bettongs that we're trying to release, or to, continue surviving, if they are still out here? And essentially, I wanted to say that definitely we want dingoes in the landscape with these animals. I mentioned before that dingoes are very territorial and they occupy a really large territory. And the reason that that's important is because for any dingo that you kill, 40 foxes can move into that same area, which is massive. So if you think about a dingo's area or a dingo's territory, for every dingo that you kill, 40 foxes will move into that same area. A lot of people I talk to think that the number is much higher than 40 foxes. The bounty rates in Victoria show that for every dingo that is killed, 200 foxes are brought in. So that's, a huge amount of foxes. I've also got this picture here, which I think creates a pretty stark image. This is a fox fence in Victoria. So that's the kind of situation that we're in, where we are completely eradicating dingoes. That's central Victoria, where there's no dingoes left at all. So if you are a bettong and you're trying to survive in your little landscape, I think you'd much rather have one dingo in the area who is looking for kangaroos and bigger things and might sometimes go for you than having 40 foxes who are all looking for something your size. So that's sort of why it's better to have dingoes in the landscape than to not have dingoes in the landscape, even if they were to prey upon a couple of these smaller, endangered animals. The other thing to note there is that places like Australian Wildlife Conservancy and Bush Heritage do have fenced areas where they are releasing lots of these endangered animals. And it's within a fenced area like that you probably don't want to have dingoes. So that makes a lot of sense. Dingoes don't have their place there. But outside those fenced areas, you definitely want to have dingoes in the landscape to be regulating it and keeping it balanced. Well, I wanted to just go back to Wooleen Station there and mention why we choose to retain dingoes when we have cattle and how they benefit our production with cattle as well. So I already mentioned that dingoes are doing a great job of controlling kangaroos and goats. We know that dingoes and sheep don't really mix. And so when you have sheep, especially in a place like this, you do need to have other protection measures for your sheep. So that might be Maremas, which are livestock guardian dogs. It might be donkeys. It might be fencing. Whatever really could work for you, that's great. But essentially, it's really tough to have sheep out here anyway. And there's not many sheep properties left in this region. We're mostly all cattle out here. Wild dingoes can prey on some calves. It's very, very rare that it happens. And when it does happen, it's such a small number that, here at Wooleen Station, we think that it's well and truly worth it for the pasture gains. So when you have dingoes in the area, you can run way more cattle because you're having that better control of the other herbivores or the unmanaged herbivores. And essentially, David, the owner of Wooleen, he doesn't think that he can responsibly, run this station without the presence of dingoes there, because he knows how hard it was to try and control the kangaroos and the goats previously. So where was I going to go with that? So essentially, we've got cattle here, and one of the hardest things historically out here was trying to control the total grazing pressure. So the total grazing pressure comes from managed animals, whether you have sheep or cattle, and they also come from, our goats and kangaroos, our unmanaged grazers as well. So essentially, you can manage your grazing pressure from your managed animals. So if you think about, you can choose how many cattle or sheep you have on your property at any given time, but what you can't control is how many kangaroos you have on your property. So they're the unmanaged grazers. And essentially, somewhere like this in a semi-arid landscape, David sort of says that things like rotational grazing are just not possible unless you have control of the total grazing pressure. And that's because if you are trying to implement rotational grazing through the paddock system, so say you've got cattle in one paddock and then you move them onto another paddock and then you move them onto another paddock and you don't take them back to the first one until there's some recovery happening in that paddock, essentially you can't do that. You can't apply that rotational grazing if you have goats and kangaroos just coming in and smashing the paddock when the cattle aren't in it. And obviously goats and kangaroos are not very respective of fences that you put up unless they're good, proper kangaroo fences. So essentially things like rotational grazing and responsible grazing become really hard out here if you don't have, a handle on the total grazing pressure. And so that's where the dingoes come in and really help us out. Wonderful. So I have now gone through the role of the dingo in our landscapes and why they're so important and where they fit in with our native animals as well. And I'm now going to talk about one last topic, and it's a pretty controversial one. So I'm going to be talking all about wild dogs and dingoes. So a lot of people, when they hear the term wild dog, and when I'm giving presentations, I often ask people if they like wild dogs, and everybody usually says no. But when I ask them if they like dingoes, they all usually say yes. And I find that very fascinating because the term wild dog actually means dingo. So every single time we're using the words wild and dog together, wild dog, we're actually talking about dingoes. And I know this might be a bit to get our head around because, it was the same with me when I first learnt this. I thought that, well, one, I believed the myth that there were no dingoes left, that they're all bred with dogs, and also didn't really understand the term wild dog either. So I will spend a little bit of time explaining this term. So essentially, when you hear the term wild dog, what you're picturing usually is a feral domestic dog. So you probably picture, an introduced animal that you think shouldn't be in our landscapes. But what you should picture from now on is a pure dingo, because that's actually what we're talking about. So we're not talking about feral dogs, and we're not talking about stray dogs either. We're talking about the term wild dog. Now, the thing is that, when you hear the term wild dog, it's often in negative terms. So it might be talking about how many sheep the wild dogs are eating. You might hear 1080 poison for wild dogs. There's plenty of signs that people pass on the way into Wooleen Station saying 1080 poison, wild dog. So all of those times that you hear the term wild dog, we are actually talking about dingoes. The thing is that feral domestic dogs are not an established pest in Australia. And this catches a lot of people out. So essentially, for a feral domestic dog to be an established pest, they have to be able to breed up their numbers in the wild. So I'm not saying that there aren't any feral dogs. So one dog could go out, pardon me, catch its own rabbits, catch its own food, find some water and survive. Probably not very likely to survive out here over summer, but they probably can do it. So essentially, I'm not saying that there's no feral dogs out there. But what happens is a feral dog roaming around somewhere like this, they're going to run into someone. And the one that they're going to run into is a dingo. Now, if a domestic dog is to run into a dingo, they're probably going to run into a stable family group or a dingo couple that's already got their territory. And so the most likely thing that would happen is that that dog's not going to get accepted on a territory of a dingo, and it's probably going to be killed. Now, if you're in an adverse situation where, maybe it's a female dog and she's on heat and she's run into a male dingo, essentially, if that male dingo doesn't have a female dingo nearby, they could actually breed. And now if this dog and dingo breed together, you'd have a 50-50 hybrid, so a dog-dingo hybrid. If that hybrid was to survive, which again is not very likely, I already talked about needing, equal parental care, very high cub mortality, things like that. So this hybrid would have to combat those things to survive. If that hybrid does survive, it would then run into another dingo to breed with. It wouldn't run into another dog because there's not enough dogs out here for that to happen. So essentially, if that hybrid is to breed with a dingo, you're very quickly breeding out the dog genes. So very quickly, you've got a 75% dingo, and that is a high content dingo. And essentially, those dingoes, we just call them dingoes because they look like a dingo, they act like a dingo, they're performing the role of a dingo. So essentially, the message here is if you see a feral domestic dog, don't worry about it. It will either die or it will become a dingo. So not really a problem out here. So there's sort of concepts there about domestic dogs not being able to survive in the wild. This is kind of called like behavioral ecology. So these are just concepts, but essentially we also know that domestic dogs have never been recorded repopulating in the wild. So to be an established pest, you have to have one dog, finds another dog in the wild, can breed with that dog in the wild, raise a litter of puppies that make it to breeding age without the assistance of people. And essentially, like, that just hasn't been recorded, essentially. So that's, that's where I'm saying, like, domestic dogs, they can't establish their own populations in the wild. But we don't just know, that all the wild dogs are actually dingoes based on those concepts that I just talked about. We also know from DNA studies as well. So here I've got a map from a paper that just recently came out, and you can see that all of the red dots on the map are actually dingoes, and the orange dots are historical dingo back crosses. So they're the ones that are like really high content dingo that I was talking about. So 75% or higher is the orange dots. There was a study that came out in 2019 testing 5,039 dead wild dogs. I don't know that they were all controlled, but a lot of the samples came from wild dogs. I'm saying that with like quotation marks, wild dogs that had been killed like either on pastoral land or farming land or by general land managers or hunters. And essentially out of over 5,000 of those wild dog samples, only 30 of them were feral domestic dogs. So that kind of just tells us that much greater than 99% of wild dogs are actually dingoes. So yeah, I'm hoping from now you can kind of get an idea that the term wild dog does mean dingo. And again, like if you are actually talking about something like a stray dog, that's very different. So there's plenty of like communities and that will have stray dogs. Essentially, domestic dogs need something human made to survive. So whether that's like human rubbish or human shelters, things like that, to survive, or man-made watering points as well. And I just think that the wild dog concept is a really, really important one, because if we're talking about land management, once again, we know that the dingo is pretty essential in our balanced ecosystems. They're very, very helpful for us as a management tool, even on a cattle property as well. And so essentially, if you know that you don't have to worry about feral dogs, or that dingoes come in different colours and that you therefore don't have a feral dog problem, it's really, really important in terms of managing the land appropriately. Fantastic. So that's sort of the end of the presentation there. I'm not sure if any questions have come through, but definitely happy to answer some questions if they have. Also, feel free to reach out to me or any of these organisations afterwards as well if you have any questions for the relevant people. Yeah, definitely happy to answer questions anytime.
Oh, thanks so much, Zali. That was really
Yeah.
interesting. I had some like questions going through, and then you sort of answered most of my questions I had as well. So very well thought out, and you definitely have busted some myths that I've had about dingoes, and yeah, really good explaining the difference between dingoes and wild dogs, and just the color, like the different colors as well, and yeah, how we can sort of identify the difference out in the wild, and just hearing the complexity as well of how they, or their behavior in the landscape, and how like Wooleen are, you know, utilizing them as that management tool for that kind of, yeah, conservation, and yeah, to keep the kind of grazing pressure at a good level. So no, it was really interesting to hear that, and yeah, and I'm sure, yeah, I guess it is like a complex and can be controversial topic. So it was just good to hear about your in-depth studies and knowledge on the topic. And I'm sure if people do have further questions about it, and yeah, they can reach out to you. Or I was going to mention that at the start that this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded on the RegenWA website later on, so, and that will be linked through YouTube, so I guess people can add questions on there as well. So,
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much.
no worries.
I just can see a question. Do we have any idea of a rough number of dingoes in WA? So no, not really. On Wooleen Station alone, if we were going off the size of the station, which is 130,000 hectares, and going off like the smaller end of a dingo's territory size, we assume that there's probably up to 40 dingo territories on Wooleen. So within that territory, as I say, it could be like, you know, one dingo, two dingoes, or a little family group on each territory. But yeah, so just going off territory size though, but we don't actually really know specific numbers of how many dingoes there are. We know that in the southwest of WA, there's no dingoes left at all. And there is actually a dingo fence, or cleverly termed dog fence, that does run sort of from the sheep and farming country in the south, and then separates sort of the pastoral country. Do dingoes bark or just howl? Good question. So dingoes howl, happy dingoes howl. So howling is just a form of communication for dingoes. Often out here, we can hear dingoes howling in the morning. Generally around breeding season is when we hear them howling the most in the mornings, which is pretty cool. Dingoes that are howling are just talking to each other. Dingoes can actually bark, but if they're barking, they're a bit distressed. So dingoes, when there's a like a stranger or something that they're not sure about in their environment, because dingoes are really wary animals and they're very like you know, attuned to things that are going on in their environment. If something's off-putting for them, or like a stranger's coming close to them, they start huffing first, and then they can do like a bark or a bark howl noise as well. So if you're anywhere, you know, out in the bush and a dingo is barking, it's telling you, can you please leave my territory? You know, I'm not feeling comfortable about you being here. So it's not really a good thing if you hear a dingo barking, but definitely if you hear dingoes howling, that's pretty cool. Awesome. Well, I might see if I can find a dingo. Shall I do that?
Sure.
So I'll just pop my camera off for a second and walk away and see if I can go and find a dingo. This is Stephen. He was just having a nap, but he's pretty cuddly, so I don't think he minds that I grabbed him up to meet everybody. So Steve is an alpine dingo who lives here, and he's been here, he's just a year old now, so he hasn't been here for very long at Wooleen, but he usually comes along to presentations here that we have with dingoes. So if anybody's visiting Wooleen, you can book in and meet Eulalia and Steve. He's having a good snooze now because we usually take them for a walk off lead for a couple of hours every morning, and so his son is, you know, running around and all of that this morning, which is fantastic. Yeah, so Steve is so he's an alpine dingo, so he actually has this like really fluffy, beautiful coat. So not one that you probably see out here, and not one that people are used to seeing photos of either. Whereas like Eulalia, the girl that we have here, she is actually a desert dingo. So she's got wild-born rescue parent from desert country in New South Wales. Yeah, Steve is like, nah, I wasn't into that. That's fine. Thanks,
He's
Steve.
camera shy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they don't mind, like you're just giving him a pat, and he's like quite affectionate.
Yeah, dingoes are, I find it quite hard to describe how they're behaviorally different when you work with them or own them in captivity. So dingoes are, in my opinion, just super like predictable and I guess like floppy is a good word to put it. So you know, with domestic dogs, they obviously are great companions and they're interested in what you're doing all the time. They always check in with you. And domestic dogs are generally pretty good at, you know, caring about what you want or what you think. Like domestic dogs do like to please people. Whereas with dingoes, they just don't have that at all. So they're really, really independent. You can't train them. So unless you have a high reward, like kangaroo or something, they're not going to just do things on command. So they always have to have pay involved. So Steve comes to the talks because he enjoys it, because he knows that there's always treats involved. And if he doesn't show up, then he doesn't show up really. So it's sort of just he does what he wants. But yeah, so dingoes are like behaviorally very different to dogs, but probably not in the ways that you would expect. I said before that they're pretty predictable. Essentially, like if you don't do the wrong thing by them and you build the trust with them, then yeah, they can be really quite loving and that, but you just can't expect them to, you know, really like respond to you, or you can't train them, and they're not really good companions either. So yeah.
Well, there's some positive comments saying great talk, very informative, and thanking you. And yeah, I'd like to add to that too by thanking you, Zali. It was really informative.
Yeah.
Definitely cleared up a lot of confusion around dingoes, I'm sure, for everyone that's attended online. And yeah, it was very, yeah, very well received. So really appreciate your time, and to everyone that joined live as well. Thanks for joining live, and this will be shared later on if anyone wanted to catch up or yeah, watch it again. So yeah, thanks so much, Zali, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Thanks for joining me.
All right,
Bye.
bye.